Can the Aztec Empire and the United States of America in any way be favorably compared? I'm going to work on that on this video. People really like the idea of historical comparisons, comparing the United States to certain 1930s countries, the Roman Empire, etc., comparing modern politicians to certain 30s politicians, etc. Now, the big problem with this comparison thing is, yep, it's popular and we like doing it, but once we've kind of made up our mind we're making the comparison, we have a tendency to look for only favorable comparisons where it's like, oh, yes, I see this here, I see this there, therefore we have a parallel. What we don't do is then do a similar list looking for things that are not comparable. And I think in most cases, if not all, you're going to find that in your comparison, there are far more non comparable items than there are comparable. So the question starts becoming is what's the point of this? Now, I've heard people making comparisons of the US following in the footsteps of the Roman Empire for as long as I've lived. And these characterizations are off on very many levels. Yeah, if you strain hard enough, you do find some parallels. But a lot of these parallels can be found in any society that's begun their downslope. And if you look at some of these comparisons, like with the Roman Empire, they survived for hundreds of years with some of these defects. So these don't really give us an indication of what's really happening. Now, I noticed recently Cernovich on X basically called out BS on the whole comparing to the Roman Empire thing. Yeah, and I agree with him there fully. And he did suggest the idea that knowing the history of Rhodesia, South Africa, or perhaps the machinations of the Russian Revolution would be useful things in its place. And I do think these are good things to understand. I mean, the history there is important, but I don't think these locations are good indications of our future. And if they are an indication of our future, it's a future that's a long ways off. If we look at essentially the majority minority situations of Rhodesia and South Africa, it's not remotely the same here at all, and it never will be because it's not an inverted power structure. Europeans were the majority, and even if we get to a point where the Europeans are the minority, that's in no way indicating, because I mean, we're going to end up with a plurality of people rather than any specific majority. And there's no telling who's going to ally with whom in order to set up the new power structure. So I don't think Rhodesia and South Africa really hit the mark at all. Now, in terms of revolutionary Russia, there are a lot of groups trying to play out that game. However, our establishment is actually very strong and deep. Russia's leadership class had waded through 20 or so continuous years of existential crisis to reach a spot where they were so weak that any organized group could have toppled them. So, why Aztecs? Well, someone posed the question to me is what historical culture is a representation of ours? And, please don't bring up the people from the 1930s. So, I believe establishments are the natural order of how humans organize. I think governments are just a visible portion of the establishment. Now, sometimes the establishment and the government are one and the same, but for the most part, they aren't. And we can see establishments running back to the Roman Empire, probably the Greek city states as well. The Aztecs, we don't have as good information because one, their writing system, and two, a lot of their history was reinterpreted through the Spaniards. But because everybody else had an establishment, I firmly believe the Aztecs had one as well. The best way to discern it is by looking at his actions. So, Why are we getting into the establishment part? Because I believe that although culturally there's very little we can compare between the United States and the Aztecs, I think there are some similarities in our establishments. Not absolute direct linkages, but parallels. Now, one thing you always have to consider, because it's really hard to do, is the whole arrival of the conquistadors thing. There's almost kind of a God from the machine moment there. Essentially, you've got Mesoamerica just kind of going along doing its own thing, following their script, and then all of a sudden, pow, godlike super beings show in and blow the whole thing up. It'd be kind of like studying the French Revolution, and then right before the terror starts, aliens arrive. Well, no one's really going to be paying attention to all those things leading up to the terror because they're completely overshadowed by events. Same thing happens with the conquistadors. So, part of this is an exercise in projecting the future of Aztecs with no arrival of the conquistadors. I'm not talking about creating an alt future. I'm just saying don't think of the conquistadors as this brick wall that just ends everything, because from the Aztecs' point of view, they were going to be continuing on into infinity. So, to properly conceive their establishment, we need to look at the world the way they do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the US to start setting this up. The US is not merely a national establishment, it's a global establishment. It does not look in any way like the Roman Empire, governing philosophies and how it put people under power and control, not at all. It shares some similarities with the British Empire. I think we learned a lot from them. But from a historical perspective, our establishment is quite different. Now, essentially, our establishment is neoliberal, and neoliberalism is essentially American progressivism for the world. So let's look at a critical element of neoliberalism. Consider that the trade system set up by the neoliberal order is often touted as free trade, but this isn't exactly true. The architects of the neoliberal order saw that trade order based on the US providing security would not necessarily be beneficial to the US, and that it would in fact be a burden. Having the dollar as a reserve currency offsets some of that burden, but doesn't pay for it. Global trade agreements help others industrialize, as we can see since the 1960s to current, and it raises their standard of living, as we can see, but it hasn't really done a lot for the American standard of living. And I think it's not designed to. So the mask of neoliberalism fully came off with the fall of the Soviet Union. Prior to 1990, everyone, oh well, it's just this, the anti-communist and the pro-communist blocs going up against each other. However, as soon as the Soviets fell out of power in Russia, post-Cold War Russia wanted to be part of the neoliberal order, but they wanted to be an equal partner. And this is unacceptable to the neoliberal order. So the order, with whatever issues it started with the Soviets, just continued to do to the Russians post-communism. Post-Cold War Russia was helpless. And at the time, the West considered China just one of the boys. So it wasn't about communism at all. But the neoliberal order felt it necessary to keep nibbling away at the periphery of Russia until it was at its borders. Point being is, there are elements going on within the neoliberal order uh, that are characteristic, regardless of the ideology of whom they're up against. So let's get into the Aztecs a little bit. So, in order for this to make sense, we have to approach it from an Aztec centric view. These are people who are at the cusp of technological innovation. The rest of the world is unknown to them. Their culture is ascendant, it's on the advance, they're on the move. The known civilized world is either under their control or bound by their influence. When new cultures are discovered, they're cataloged to see how they're going to fit into the future of the world created by the Aztecs. Now, I'm going to kind of go off the path a little bit and give you a little bit more Aztec background than might be necessary, but I think it's kind of interesting to see that although in many ways quite savage, they were quite organized with a real sense of direction. They knew what they wanted to do. So the Aztec establishment was made up of the nobility, merchants, and the priesthood. And the army plays a really minor role as the Aztecs maintained only a small standing army in times of peace. During war, they could mobilize fairly rapidly and potentially deploy upwards to 200,000 soldiers. Their military functioned very similar to feudal levies, where the nobles were expected to be the first to bulk up the small standing army, and then they would levy peasants as needed for the particular war. The Aztecs were highly organized. The Spanish would describe the Aztec cities as very clean, much cleaner than the Spanish cities they'd left behind. The Aztec society was very orderly, and corruption seemed very minimal. The Aztec Empire stretched to both oceans and went as far as south as Guatemala and stretched north to the deserts. Now, the merchant class functioned very similar to a guild or groups of corporations. They had obligations to the emperor in order to operate freely in their area of commerce. Merchants were trained in the art of espionage. When trading, their goal was to assess if there was unrest forming in any of the areas within the empire, or look at an area that was failing to make proper tributes, and the merchants would determine if those shortcomings were legitimate or if they were holding out. When when they were dealing with tribes that are outside the empire, the Aztec merchants would live among the non-Aztec people to determine their military strength. In fact, their trading post functioned a lot like a modern embassy. They would look at the full potential of what trade goods were available. They would look for societal rifts that could be exploited, like maybe the chief's brother, who had no route to power, who felt he'd been slighted, who might basically uh, turn on the his entire group if he could be in charge underneath the Aztecs. The merchants would compile detailed reports which would be sent back to the royal court. So if merchants determined that there was critical resources that needed to be under empire control, or if the nation they're in was working to create some kind of anti-Aztec alliance, or was in some other way an issue, that tribe or nation would be considered open to being added to the empire. Now, if the tribe and if the tribe capitulated without fighting, they would pretty much be allowed to run things the way they always had. They get to keep their government. They just have to send tribute to the national capital. They'd have to co-adopt um, the religion. Basically, what they'd have to do is say, well, our supreme God is literally the same as your supreme God. We get to keep his name and worship the same way we had. We just have to acknowledge that they're the same. Uh, However, if it got to a point where the, the potential target decided that they weren't going to play ball and they were actually going to put up resistance, then the Aztecs might attempt subterfuge by looking for internal divisions. Failing that, they would actually go to war. They'd always attempt to draw the enemy army out of the villages and into the fields to minimize the amount of damage to the civilians and the infrastructure. Essentially, when the army went on the march, they knew the exact numbers they needed to take the place due to what the merchants had detailed in their reports. Literally, they could be to any place on the edge of the empire within a week with as many thousands of troops as they thought needed to do what was needed. They never used more manpower than was necessary because they were not a rich people. They supplied their army en route. The army did not actually carry any of their own supplies, which allowed them to move quickly. They picked up supplies along the way from the villages. The army would approach from multiple different directions so as to not all overwhelm a town with requests. Supply troops would be in the advance making requisitions ahead of the army so that all the necessary items were waiting along the way. This allowed them to march quickly and fast. Now, the Aztecs went to war to secure resources. And to the Aztecs, sacrifices for their religion were also necessary resources. Now, under their legal code, you couldn't just sacrifice anybody. If you were under the Aztec Empire's protection, there were very limited ways you could end up being a sacrifice. Typically, being a criminal, a rebel, and in some cases, some slaves could be sacrificed. The only people truly open to sacrifice were captives from battle from another land. So if internal rebellion and crime failed to generate enough captives, declaring war on outsiders to generate captives was part of the Aztec modus operandi. Any particular temple complex in a major city might need between 30 to 300 sacrifices per year, and there was a record 20,000 for one of the big temples being opened up. Some of the sacrifices being performed are kind of like maintenance functions, like tending to the sun and the weather. However, a major driver to this was the Aztec belief that the world was formed and destroyed in cycles. The Aztecs believed that this cycle was coming to an end, but they also believed that more sacrifices would prolong the cycle. A major reason the Aztecs needed to expand was to acquire more legal sacrifices. The Aztecs were true believers. You don't follow some kind of Pascal's wager version of things thinking, well, gods may or may not be real, so to be on the safe side, we need to kill people. No, they really believed that what they were doing was protecting existence itself. So, all that Aztec stuff, kind of interesting, but what does it have to do with the American establishment? Well, progressivism, in my opinion, is a religion. And if you don't believe that, I recommend you check out a book called Minister's Reform. If you basically look at progressivism, it has all the elements of a disorganized religion. Now, people who aren't progressives aren't just merely associates who disagree to the progressive group. They are evil itself. Now, there are certain sacraments within the progressives that must be performed in order for good things to occur. If what you do doesn't produce a good result, well, you can't do something different. You have to do the same thing harder or more. If the neighboring religion, the non progressive, does not believe what you believe, you can't just leave them alone. Their mere existence can't be tolerated. And if progressivism is properly implemented, it will bring paradise to earth, salvation through government. The neoliberal order is merely the ideal of American progressivism made global. Look again at neoliberal trade dogma. It's not true free trade. It's managed trade resting on the backs of security provided by the US taxpayer. Does the cost of open sea lanes bring back more net benefit to the US than we pay? Nobody knows, but I very much doubt it. However, based on neoliberal statements from the very beginning of putting all this together, they don't care if there's a return. Why is that? Because it's a spiritual good. It's a tenet of neoliberalism. It's also not a mere coincidence that all the American progressive excesses of the last 5-6 years spilled over into the government functions advancing the neoliberal order globally. Look at the craziness of attempting to advance trans and gay culture into societies where it's liable to get those people killed. It's not remotely logical. It is spreading the gospel. It is getting the word out. Every inch of the earth must be in the neoliberal sphere. Inch by inch encroachments on nuclear powers, warning you to step back. They can't. Paradise itself is on the line. You can't stop the expansion. Starting a proxy war in a country with no particular value to the West, risking open war with a near peer superpower? Gotta do it. The ascendancy of the neoliberal order is far more important than any number of people it kills in the process of getting there. In short, progressivism is a religion. Neoliberalism is its international counterpart. Despite its individual parts making no sense, the entire package, we're told, will create heaven on earth. This makes no sense to anyone other than a true believer. It must expand to survive. Aztecs needed to kill to keep the world running. They expanded to get the bodies that were sacramentally legitimate to sacrifice. It makes no sense other than to a true believer. They both must expand to survive. So, what do you think? Did I make a case there? Tell me in the comments section below. And again, I'm not trying to say that the societies are one and the same and they look exactly the same or do anything the same. I'm saying that the establishments of both were motivated more by a belief system or its self-survival than it was any sensible outcome. Okay, please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, check out my other titles. I'm sure you'll find stuff you will find interesting. Subscribe. And if you know somebody who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.